Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s World Affairs Today program. I'm Heidi Shoup, President of the Council, and it's my privilege to welcome you here this evening for a discussion with author James Fallows. Mr. Fallows is a national correspondent for The Atlantic and has written for the magazine since the late 1970s. Raised a Californian, he studied American history and literature at Harvard College, where he was the editor of the daily newspaper, the Harvard Crimson. He was a Rhodes Scholar and subsequently worked as an editor and writer for the Washington Monthly and the Texas Monthly magazines. And for the first 2 years of the Carter administration, he was Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter. At the time, and perhaps still, the youngest person to have held that job. From 1979 through 1996, he was the Washington editor for The Atlantic. For 2 years of that time, he was based in Texas, and 4 years of that time in Asia. He has written about immigration, defense policy, politics, economics, computer technology, and more. He has been a finalist for the National Magazine Award 5 times and won in 2003 for The 51st State, which was published 6 months before the invasion of Iraq and laid out the difficulties of occupying that country. He won an Emmy in 2010 for his role as host of the documentary series Frontline, Doing Business in China. He's the author of 10 books, including National Defense, for which he received the 1983 National Book Award. In the 80s and 90s, he was a frequent contributor of commentaries to National Public Radio's Morning Edition, and since 2009, he has been the regular news analyst for NPR's Weekend All Things Considered. From 96 to 98, he was the editor of U.S. News and World Report, and he was the founding chairman of the New America Foundation, a nonprofit group based here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Fallows has had a long interest in technology, both writing about and helping to develop it, and he's an instrument-rated pilot. So his latest work, China Airborne, about which he's going to speak with us this evening, benefits from his wide-ranging experience and interests. Please join me in welcoming James Fallows.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for your very gracious introduction. Thank you all for coming out this evening. I really appreciate it. I'll say something which is both a good and bad introduction, which is about 18 hours ago I got off the plane from Shanghai. So I have both the freshness of experience and the dazedness of personal affect that comes from that experience. But I'll try to convey what I saw when I was there in the past week and over the past years, and surmount I'll have my excitement at speaking with you surmount my fatigue at getting off the plane. It is a real pleasure to be in front of your group. I admire so much what you've done, including the scholarship program. I hadn't intended to be giving a plug for the scholarship program that the World Affairs Council runs, but I'll do that. I often saw in China the tremendous difference that it made to have people there have firsthand experience in the outside world. Sometimes in the west of China, in Gansu or Qinghai or western Sichuan, I'd see village people who had never been beyond the confines of their village. And if they could go to the big city, or if they had relatives who'd been someplace outside China, it made an enormous difference. So too with some people in America. I think it makes a tremendous difference for them to have seen the broader world beyond their own hometown, their own village, as it were. So I admire what you do in making this kind of exposure possible. What I'm going to do today is to speak not for too long. I'd like to allow enough time for questions and discussion, but mainly to convey what my wife, Deborah, and I have been immersed in for the last 6 years in trying to understand China and explain it to readers in the U.S. and around the world, and some in China too. I'm going to do this initial presentation in 3 main parts. First, I'm going to explain why I wrote the kind of book I have most recently produced, my book, China Airborne. It's different in its approach from some of my other books, but it's one that I enjoyed having done more than many of my other books. As a side note, I assume many people in this audience have written books. and many people probably aspire to write books. You all know that there is nothing good about actually writing a book. The only good thing is the having done it. It's fun learning what you learn while you're doing the research. It's fun having done it. And the only reason you go through the writing part is if you feel that you can't not do it. That was the circumstance I was in this book, and I'll explain to you why and why I thought the story I had come across was particularly valuable for conveying something about modern China and its prospects. Second, I'm going to talk about a number of the intersecting dramas that I thought came together in the narrative I had come across, and why I think these are all part of both the excitement and the unknowability, the open-endedness of developments in China. One of my themes in this book is that anyone who is certain about Chinese development, either its good aspects or its bad aspects or its path 10 or 15 years from now, anybody who is certain either knows a lot more than I do and other people there, or knows a lot less, because the imponderables and the contradictory forces are so vivid. So I'll talk second about the various dramas. And then third, I'm going to talk in a larger sense about some of the questions for China at this stage in its evolution, with the economic transformations and turmoils of the past couple of years, those that are affecting it right now, with the political transition that's happening in China this year, coinciding with the U.S. Political transition, about some of the interesting news of the last couple of months in China, political and otherwise, and then say what questions this raises for the United States in our own time of political choice and political transition. So that is the plan. First, why I wrote this book. Second, the various narratives that I thought were compelling and I wanted to convey. And third, bigger China questions and U.S.-China questions. And then we'll turn to questions and discussions. So the reason I wrote this book, the introduction here is my wife's and my experience in China and in Asia over the past now quarter century. When we moved to Japan with our then young children in the mid-1980s, we went there because we wanted to see the Japanese phenomenon that was then so important in the world's economy, and to have some sense of what was promising about it, what, if anything, might be threatening about it, how the United States should think about it. We ended up staying for 4 years in East Asia, essentially the heart of our children's elementary school years. 2 years in Japan, 2 years in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, and traveling around all the countries of the region. And we first went to China with our children in the summer of 1986. I assume how many people had been to China by the mid-'80s. So there's a base of experience here in those early days of China's opening to the West. In those days, it was not automatic to get a visa as an American to go to China. The way that we were able to arrange ours was as part of the American delegation to the World Esperanto League, which was holding its convention in Beijing. My wife is a linguistics person. One of her friends was the head of the American Esperanto League, and we made our children learn Esperanto with us for a month so that we could go to the conference in Beijing. Our children were bitterly resentful at this oddity we had forced on them. First, we made them go to Japanese public school, then learning Esperanto. They forgave us only when they met the world's apparently only native speaker, monolingual native speaker of Esperanto, which was a girl in New Zealand whose parents, American emigres, had raised her not speaking any English but only Esperanto. So the only people she'd ever met she could talk with apart from her parents were our two boys, who they were slightly more forgiving of my wife and me after they saw what they had avoided. We traveled in China for a number of weeks then and had all of the adventures of China in early stage development. Those adventures included my wife getting very, very sick from something she had eaten when we were in Guilin, having our children, who were very blonde-haired and blue-eyed, being objects of attention wherever they went, and myself as a journalist being under surveillance whenever we went in hotels or in the big cities. After that introductory exposure in the mid-'80s, we went back periodically through the '80s and '90s and early 2000s. But because I had not had any sustained experience in China, I wanted very much journalistically to go there for a substantial period of time. after doing, as Heidi mentioned, a number of Iraq war policy reportage in the sort of mid-2000s, I wanted to have a change of scene. So in the summer of 2006, my wife and I moved to Shanghai. Our children were by this point grown. We were planning to stay for a year or two. We ended up staying for 3+ and went back again for several months last year. And what we found ourselves trying to convey in our various forms of writing and communications was the exciting and contradictory and overwhelming, in a good sense, phenomenon of being in China at this stage of its development. I'll say a note here about the kind of market niche that a magazine like The Atlantic occupies. I will take for granted that all of you read The Atlantic, follow it, subscribe to it, keep it in business. We're the oldest magazine in the United States. We're also now profitable with our website and our print version. And what we try to do is, when correspondents like me or Jeff Goldberg or Bob Kaplan or our other writers go someplace, usually the main way to winnow out what we should write on is what is different being on scene compared to what we'd read about before getting there, because we assume our readers to be informed with the highest end journalism. And so if there are things that are different by being on scene compared with writing, that's the arbitrage, the market gap we can occupy. Now, I recognize there is sort of a convoluted Hall of Mirrors phenomenon to this, because I'm saying the writing that we're doing is what you can trust, even though we're saying what was missing from all previous writing. So I recognize that, but still, the way that I ended up trying to decide what was worth writing about and what not is things that were surprising to me, having been there from the mid-'80s and reading about it. And some of this sense was, of course, the excitement and the vim and the can-do and the everything happening at once phenomenon of China. During the first 18 months we were in Shanghai, there were two new entire subway lines that opened in that period. We know how long it takes to open a station here in DC. There were another couple lines that opened in Beijing when we were there before the Olympics. So we saw the energy, the hustle. We also saw the simultaneous truth of wildly contradictory phenomena in all ways, how things were hopeful and depressing and progressive and regressive and touching and cruel and everything else that was the entirety of human experience, of course, you would see in China. And I found myself, in the first article I did, 2006, I figured, for The Atlantic, there was one free pass that any correspondent gets on his or her first immersion in a country and saying, I just got off the boat, here are the things I'm wondering about, and at the end of my stint, I'll try to explain how these things come together. And I listed a number of those that were surprising to me on this re-immersion in China. And one of those I mentioned early on, I came to understand in a more ramified way, was the simultaneously controlled and out of control nature of modern Chinese life. Particular cones where you have this very intensive supervision and control, and the rest where anything goes, and it's almost a state of nature. And that sort of contradiction I ended up finding lots of illustrations of. But as the months and years went on, and I tried to talk more and more about what we were seeing in China, I evolved a two-tier philosophy for this kind of journalism, more than I had in other places where I'd worked. And it was, one of the tiers was the view from above, the summary view saying, here's how you should think about the environment. Should you be really depressed or really encouraged about things that are going on in China? My answer, not surprisingly, was both. Here's how you should think about the outsourcing movement in China. Is this good or bad? Here's how you should think about urban migration, et cetera. So I did a number of those overview pieces saying, here's what I've come to conclude about what to think about the economic tension between the US and China. I also developed more and more appreciation for the quasi-novelistic, universal in the particular type approach of people who had found a province, a person, a company, a historical showdown, and they were able to draw some larger themes about China from the particular tale they were telling. Now, this obviously is not unique to China or to these modern times, but a lot of the literature that's valuable about what's happening there, I think, has profited from this. A couple of my favorites in this novelistic vein are the book Foreign Babes in Beijing. I don't know if this is familiar to you. It's by a young American woman named Rachel DeWaskin, who became the slutty star of a soap opera in China. And so in the 90s, she was famous as the kind of vamp Kardashian figure on a Chinese soap opera. And she wrote about China in that stage of modernization from the perspective of a soap opera star. So that was, I thought, was valuable. There's my wife's book, Dreaming in Chinese, is about what you learn about China by learning the Chinese language, what is particular in the culture, in the mindset, or whatever the language reflects. John Pomfret's book, Chinese Lessons, which is about his classmates at Nanjing University in the 1980s and what became of them over the next 30 years, is also very valuable in this way. And I began to find a cast of characters who I thought would be my counterpart to Foreign Babes in Beijing or to Chinese Lessons. These were the people who imagined themselves as the Wright brothers and the Alan Shepards and all the other pioneers of Chinese aerospace who were trying to bring this phase of modernization and openness to China at this stage of its history. Let me mention two or three of these people and the way I came across them. The reason I first knew about these people is that I'm an avid pilot myself in my life in the United States. And on first arriving in China, I had what turned out to be completely naive and unrealistic idea that I would fly around from one remote airport to another and discover the country that way. As those of you who know anything about Chinese airspace will realize, this was not going to happen. That, for example, when I first got to China in 2006, it was then the law that any foreign pilot was supposed to have a PLA official with him in the plane if you were flying from place to place. And that was an indication of the general control of things there. So I didn't realize that ambition, but I was able to get into this weird fraternity of people trying to modernize China in aerospace technology. I'll mention one or two of them. There's a man I met early on whose family name is Xu, X-U. His family name is Changdong. I actually saw him 2 days ago in Shanghai. He was raised in Shanghai. He came to the U.S. in the early 1990s, not as a political exile, but just as somebody who was trying to get a better life for graduate school. He arrived in New York at JFK Airport with so little money that when taking the taxi from Kennedy Airport to his dormitory, he was panicked to find he had $2 left at the end of this trip. So he got a job that night, got another job the next morning. To truncate the next 20 years, he became very, very rich while in the United States. This is a typical part of the story. But he remembered a dramatic episode from his time in New York. He was on a fishing boat on Long Island Sound where there were people on both sides of the boat casting out their lines for bluefish or whatever. And somebody did a back cast, and this big hook he had caught somebody else's eye on the other side of the boat. So this was panic, desperation, trauma, and all that. The captain of the boat impressed Mr. Xu very dramatically by saying, "Please calm down. I've called the Coast Guard. In less than 8 minutes, the rescue helicopter will be here. Things are under control." So Mr. Xu watched. It was 7 minutes, 45 seconds. The Coast Guard came, the rope came down, the guy went up. He learned in the next couple of days that not only did he live, but his eye was saved, and so he was rescued. And at that moment, he made the resolution that he said, if this had been in China, this man would certainly have died, he told himself. So when I go back to China, I will bring rescue helicopters for my people so that they do not have to lose their eyes in fishing accidents. Or more seriously, after the Sichuan earthquake, many, many thousands of people died of exposure because there were so few ways to rescue them. So Mr. Xu, who now is back in Shanghai, who has a huge coal business in Inner Mongolia, but he also is the head of the Chinese General Aviation Association, making helicopters for rescue squads, for a businessman, for the Beijing Police Department, and all the rest. In Xi'an, famous for its terracotta warriors, I met the man who is in charge of the 250,000 employee strong aerospace complex there, making parts for Boeing, for Airbus, for Embraer, and aspiring to have their own Boeing and Airbus and Embraer. And in his office, he has two statues. One is a statue of Deng Xiaoping. He says, because of Deng Xiaoping, I'm not behind an ox in a rice paddy right now, which I would have been. The other is a statue of George Washington. He says, he could have been a king, but decided not to. Let this be an example to our leaders, he said in a droll way. And he is inspired with the idea of trying to bring modern aerospace technology to his people. I met a man named whose family name is Zhang. First name is Yue. I also saw him this last week in Shanghai. It was an odd coincidence. This is a man I came to know on my one flight as a ferry pilot in China, where this is something I describe in the introduction to the book of the ill-starred trip I almost didn't come back from, of ferrying a small plane to the Zhuhai Air Show. And this is a man who was trained as an industrial art student. He's now probably in his late 40s. He and his brother invented a kind of air conditioning technology which is ideal for places with bad electric supplies. If you have browned out electric supplies, their air conditioner is the right kind. They've become hugely successful in China, in India, and Pakistan. So he now lives in this compound that rivals Xanadu or anything you can imagine, with a life-size replica of the Palace of Versailles and a giant pyramid of Egypt made of golden glass and other things, and his own environmentally friendly Air Force that he is building. So he's often on the phone with Al Gore, and he's making himself a tribune of environmentally sensitive aviation. And there were enough of these people I ended up coming across to think that everything you wanted to convey about the realistic ambitions, the crazy ambitions, the churning local and central efforts that are going on in China, you could find in this field too. So I had a cast of characters that I ended up seeing and getting to know because of my interest as a pilot. And I thought these were people who I could build a story on. I'll just allude to one other category of them, in a way the most touching. These are the people I refer to in shorthand as the Joe T contingent. Joe T is a man who originally worked for Boeing. He's known as Joe T because his family name is about 20 letters long. It's a Polish name. I think it's pronounced Timchizin, but it has numerous Z's and X's in it. He went to China about 20 years ago. He was working for Boeing in Europe then. He was very happy with his work. He was a Francophone. He was enjoying a nice European life. They said, would you like to work for us in China? His initial response was, well, not so much, because he didn't know any Chinese, he didn't know anything about China. He realized the secret with Boeing was avoiding layoffs, and that China was the place where the layoffs were least likely to occur because there was so much activity there. He has spent most of his time in China since then, essentially embedding himself in the fabric of the Chinese aerospace system and helping make the system so much safer that in a generation it's gone from one of the most dangerous in the world to one of the safest in the world, often safer than the American system. And throughout the texture of this part of Chinese ambition, you find young Americans, old Americans, people, international people of every vintage who have shown the surprising permeability of the Chinese system apart from its top-level closedness. To wind up this first part of what I'm talking about, and I without driving it into the ground, so to speak, while doing high-level overview pieces for The Atlantic, I kept coming across figures who no one in the Western press had ever written about, doing things no one had described, building these 100 airports in the wilds of the country. So they became the spine for my narrative, for the way I could tell my China story. Now, part two of the themes in China that I thought were worth conveying this way. And I'll just mention 4 or 5 of them that I think are significant. The main question that my book is positioned as an answer to is what I think of as the main question about China at this stage of its maturity. And it's one I addressed last Sunday in a piece in the New York Times Sunday Review section. The question was essentially, is China going to make it as a really modern, really developed society? What I mean by that is that the miracle of Chinese development in the past 30 years has been a combination of what you could think of as hard achievements. That is, it's been the transformation of a peasant economy by the hundreds of millions into an urban industrial economy as these people have moved from very, very low wage rural life to low wage, to higher but still low wage factory life in the big cities. So we've had low wage manufacturing and infrastructure and construction as the things that have made the economy go for this last 30 years, and it has been a miracle. There's been no society in human history that has ever reduced poverty in so effective and so quick and so dramatic a way as China has done. And yet, I think a lot of the question for Chinese officials and for economists looking at China is whether this model is reaching a sort of topping out point, or whether the last 30 years are part of a continuing ascent that can be assumed for the next 20 or 30. And the symbol of this question is the iPad that I hold in my hand for you, but any product or any electronic of any product would illustrate it. This, of course, was made in China. I've seen the factory where any iPad in the world has come from, like essentially all electronic goods. But as you probably know, if this cost $500, if I paid $500 for it, only about $50 stayed with anybody in China. The rest goes to Apple, it goes to the retailer, it goes to screen makers in Japan, to component makers in Korea. And in general, the synergy of the outsourcing boom in China has meant increasing jobs for people in China, but most of the profits still going to richer countries. A fascinating factoid I love, actually factoids are supposed to be false. This is a true fact. Imagine this is an iPhone. Actually, it's an Android, but imagine it were an iPhone. Every dollar in the cost of an iPhone is counted as part of the trade deficit from the U.S. towards China. But in fact, every single iPhone represents an actual small trade surplus for the U.S. to China, because the U.S. components are worth more than the Chinese components. And the Japanese value of this is about 5 times more than the Chinese value. So this is the dilemma for China. Can it make the next leap to not assembling apples, but having its own Apple, not doing this work for GE and Siemens and Mitsubishi and the others, but having its own rivals towards them? I won't get into all the dimensions pro or con of whether that's going to be possible for China. I do assert that it is the big economic question for the country. And I think its economic planners would state that. The current 12th five-year plan, and five-year plans I take more seriously now than I did before living there, is all about a push into these higher value industries, into pharmaceuticals, into infotech, into more university research centers, and into aerospace. So the drama of China's larger ability to become a rich country as opposed to a bigger, low-wage country, that's part of the drama I'm trying to explore. Another aspect of the larger China story that I thought I had a real way to explore was the tension between the security state and the economic state, which goes through almost everything happening in China now. One of the big realizations for me as a journalist is that when I was there in the 80s, I knew I was followed and surveilled, and that was just how it was in the 80s. Most of the time in China recently, until very recently, I only came onto people's radar screen if I was a business opportunity or a business obstacle. Otherwise people didn't really care what was being written in English. But if I could help somebody's business, then that was a plus. And I think that is one sign of how over the last 30 years the security state has receded in many ways, but not entirely, and not in some crucial ways. And here are 2 or 3 illustrations. There was one illustration of kind of the chaos of this security versus openness openness tension just before the Olympic Games. We were living in Beijing then. The foreign ministry announced with great fanfare and with great pride that there would be an authorized protest zone around the Olympic stadiums for people who wanted to register their complaints. This would be a sign of China's maturity. As you probably know, nobody who applied for permission to protest was approved, and many people were arrested in the process of applying. So that was a sign of how things weren't entirely resolved. That kind of tension continues. It's the central issue when it comes to China's aerospace future, because the main limit on China's being able to have a business aviation model, to Mr. Xu having his helicopters going every place, is the PLA's control of the airspace and the airports and their limits on people's travel. And that battle is fought out every single day. I describe in my book the way, surprisingly, some outside mediators were able to kind of push the People's Liberation Army in a direction it didn't really want to go, to make more openness possible. Without going into it in much more detail, I'll say a real struggle for China's future and for its identity and for its potential is between security interests writ large and economic interests on the other hand. And one of the main frontiers for that is the aerospace realm. Another frontier that's been in the news just in the last couple of days is the Chinese internet situation, where I will say one sentence, and then we can discuss it in questions if you want. I submit that an important measure of China's potential and its development overall is how slow the internet is there. How the penalties imposed by the censorship regime that make it much harder to reach any site outside China than it is from other Asian countries. And this is in a way a pure test of the control state versus the economic state, because all of the aspirations that researchers or universities would have require an open internet. But I'll just leave that on the table. The role of another of the issues that was sort of coming through, and I found this was an appropriate narrative for, is the role of the environment. I assert that environmental despoilation is China's most serious problem and the main threat to its continued evolution. And this is a crucial part of the aerospace drama too, because commercial aviation, as you know, has a sort of disproportionate climate effect, because when the emissions are at high altitude, they have even more greenhouse effect than they would otherwise. So China is planning simultaneously to have a doubling of commercial aviation in the next 6 or 7 years, but to reduce the emissions thereof. The way they're trying to reconcile that is part of what I explain in the book, but in every point of China's environmental tension now, I think there's a nice edge balance between how terrible things are and how hard people are trying to deal with them. And I think that it's, whether you feel optimistic or depressed depends on which half of that divide you pay attention to. I'll mention just one or two other aspects of the big themes of China, then I'll move to the third part. It is in the contradictions I mentioned earlier and trying to make sense of China, one that I revised my views on almost every day was the feeling of the openness and the closedness of Chinese existence. I often ended up feeling that the Japanese and the Chinese cultural situations were almost complete contrast to one another, and that what made the Japanese system so precise was its sort of tribal integrity and the difficulty of outsiders of penetrating there. The Chinese society, by contrast, as you all know, is a great big shambling scrum of lots of competing forces where there's lots of entry points for foreigners. And something that was very surprising to me, and that I tried to chronicle in some detail, is how much the Chinese system had opened itself to influence and even tutelage from outsiders when it came to things that could be an improvement for how China did its operations. Here's one brief illustration. I mentioned earlier Joe T., the Boeing employee who's become essentially a Chinese reformer from inside. He was called in, and a number of his other colleagues, to solve the problem of these very, very the very high frequency of crashes of Chinese airliners. It wasn't a problem with the aircraft. They were top-end Boeing or Airbus aircraft. There was something in the procedures that were making pilots crash more often. And the outside experts were able to say the problem is one of governance. There was a time when the Chinese CAAC, the aviation body, it did everything. It made airplanes, it ran airlines, it trained pilots, it tested pilots, it sold tickets, it did everything. And this made for some problems and checks and balances, that it was hard to have the right kind of testing. For example, check flights might be given by somebody's next door neighbor for a pilot. So people from the FAA, from Boeing, from all the rest were able to work with their Chinese counterparts and saying, here is how you would have a different kind of approach to governance. Here's how you'd have real check flights. And over the last 10 or 15 years, the system has become much, much safer, indeed statistically safer than Americans in some years. Again, the fact that the Chinese system was willing to open itself to this kind of thorough association with foreigners was impressive to me. There are several more themes of Chinese life that I thought were exemplified in this drama, but I won't mention them now so that I can go to my final brief section of the big China points and the big U.S. China points and how we think about them. In one way, I think we can all take a surprising degree of heart from the U.S.-China relationship. And what I mean is the following. First, you can imagine all of the turmoil that could potentially have been caused for the world in the past 35 years and could in the decade or two ahead by the emergence of the world's most populous country and having this huge surge of economic activity, which means a reordering of all sorts of things. You know, China's economy is now the second largest in the world, overtaking Japan's. But remember, Japan has only 1/10 as many people as China, which means that China has just now become 1/10 as rich per capita as Japan has. We have the potential rise in military influence of China. We have the cultural differences between China and the United States. You would think, looking at your history books, the last 35 years could have been a time of certain collision between these two powers. It has struck me that if you start with the administration of Richard Nixon and go through all the subsequent ones to Barack Obama, the element of foreign policy that's been most consistent on the U.S. side has been its policy towards China. And I think that is a positive thing on the U.S. side and has been positive on the Chinese as well. From the U.S. side, it's been a combined, a consistently complex policy of three main elements. Number one, that we thought it was better to work with China than to have them as a certain entity, a certain enemy. Number two, that we thought that their prosperity would be, on balance, good for us and good for the world rather than zero-sum and taken away from us. And number three, that we would still disagree fundamentally on a number of issues, strategic issues, territorial issues, political values issues, Taiwan, and all the rest. And that's been within a fairly reasonable band. That's been the policy from Richard Nixon's time until ours, which I think is valuable. I think it's been good on the Chinese side, too. They've had more or less their version of that policy, that it was better to work with the U.S. than against them, despite the differences and disagreements. And so I think that we have reason to congratulate the governments of both sides in the past and to look forward, or to hope that more or less this band continues. The main question on the Chinese side, I think, is whether all the accumulating tensions, economically, politically, and all the rest, are putting its government under a kind of pressure that will make it difficult to have the relationships it's had with the U.S. over the last generation. And on the U.S. side, whether something comparable might happen. On this latest trip I've had to Shanghai over the last week, I heard people make to me exactly opposite cases with exactly equal commitment and conviction and vigor. One case was the tensions cropping up in China now are different versions of the tensions that have occurred over the past 30 years. There are economic inequalities, but they've been built in over the last 30 years. There are political disagreements and disgruntlements, but that's something the government is sort of finely attuned to and knows something about containing. There's revelation of corruption, but it's still an efficient corruption. There is various kind of social control, but it still is confined, and most people are finding some kind of overall better life. So one argument was it's more of the same. And over this long progression, life is getting better for most people. So there's that kind of assent to the system of government. There are other people who make the opposite case. They're saying that we're reaching a different kind of contradiction and tension than we've seen for quite a while. That the Bo Xilai case was affecting people differently from the way some previous cases had because of the scale of the corruption that it revealed. That the economic inequalities are reaching a new level, and average people are being pinched by the escalation in land prices and housing prices and all the rest. I don't know which of those is the case, and I don't think anybody does. But it's why the transition is worth such careful attention there. I did have people actually willing to give me predictions in the last week of the odds of the succession happening normally. You know, whether the people we assume will be in charge next year will actually be in charge. I was given sort of 60-40 odds on that, of Xi Jinping being in fact, the next president. I can talk more about that if you want. I'll leave for questions more on sort of the recent news coming out of China. I guess I came away from this latest trip feeling, as I have over the past 6 years, that the challenge for Americans is to maintain something we have surprisingly maintained in most of the last 10 years and to do something different. What we've surprisingly maintained is to avoid blaming China for most of the problems that we have. I think analytically, the United States has more economic strengths than we usually realize and more political weaknesses than we're usually willing to admit. We like to complain about our government, but still think it's structurally the best in the world. I don't think it's structurally the best in the world. I think it's structurally quite deficient, and that is a problem for us. But that has nothing to do with China. And so I think it's basically healthy that blaming China or Japan or anybody else for these problems is a second-tier element in our political discourse. We're more blaming ourselves, which is where we should go. So I think if we can maintain that, that would be good. What we should attain, that I think has been harder for Americans, is to take seriously what is going on in China and expose ourselves to it without being afraid of it. I try to argue in this book why we shouldn't really be afraid of what's happening in China, because they have more of their own contradictions and problems than we do. And you would rather be the president of the U.S. for all the harassments of that job than the president of China. But it's worth taking seriously because it will affect everything about our world. And so, therefore, part of my message is to get as many Americans as possible over there so they feel comfortable with that part of the world. To conclude, the two words you've been looking forward to. Over the last 6 years, having spent most of my time in China, I find myself really excited by what is happening there. I wanted to share the excitement with people in the outside world, those who are deeply steeped in Chinese affairs, as many of you are, those who are not. And I've tried to use a narrative that conveys the hope and the fear and the optimism and the pessimism and the goods and the bads of the current Chinese phenomenon. And if it makes anybody somewhat more interested in what's happening there, then I will have satisfied my ambition. That is my presentation. Now I'll be happy to answer any questions you have or anything else. So thanks very much.
Thank you. So I'm interested in China-Africa relations.
Mm-hmm.
And so you spoke a lot about fear of China's rise, and I think that a lot of people in the U.S. feel threatened by China's presence in Africa. So my first question, and mostly because we think maybe it'll limit our access to oil or they'll undermine our supporting human rights and governance in Africa. So my first question is, do you think that we should feel threatened by China's presence in Africa? And my second one is more related to the aerospace industry. I read an article today saying that one of the China national companies is planning in the next 5 years to sell hundreds of these new fighter jets to numerous countries in the Middle East and Africa, and one of them that they listed was Sudan. And China has a lot of oil for arms deals with African countries that we refuse to supply with
Right.
arms and do business with. So is that going to be an important part of the aerospace industry? And how long do you think China will be able to maintain this non-interference
Right.
foreign policy?
Those are excellent questions, and I think the answer to all of them is involved in the very last thing you said of how long China can maintain these policies. It would be more convenient for every country to have a purely self-interested foreign policy, just to deal with other countries on material and raw materials and trade basis, which is what China has preferred to do until for the last 30 years. There's been a rhetorical gloss to this, which is the theory of non-intervention. You don't tell us how to run our country, we won't tell you how to run your country. And this has been a convenient way to do business with Burma and with Iran and with Sudan and all the rest. And I think that as China is becoming too big to get away with that anymore. And so it would be convenient for them just to stay on that path, but there will be enough incidental friction from the Europeans and the Americans and the Russians and ASEAN, if they keep doing that they'll have to adjust. So the same kind of burdens of greater power that affect Europe and the U.S. and others will come to bear come into play on them. It's somewhat different because China's founding ideology or its current ideology is less universalistic than America's is or France's is, but it's clear that the foreign ministry is aware that there is this more and more pressure to be a responsible stakeholder. Certainly in economic and financial matters, you do see Chinese officials sort of playing ball and over the last 4 years playing a large role in international recovery. To go back to the first thing you said, should we fear their role in Africa? We should pay attention to their role in Africa as opposed to fearing it. If I were a Chinese foreign ministry official, what I'd say right now is, number one, yes, we're having a colonial type presence in Africa, but we're doing it without the gunboats. When the Europeans were in Africa, they were there invading. We're just selling our highways and taking our oil and setting up our trading missions. So they feel as if by historical standards they're not being that bad. They're not actually colonizing them. And number two, they would say, oh, yeah, we're going to get these African sources of oil after the Westerners get Saudi Arabia and the Westerners get Iraq and had Iran over the years. So they feel as if they're kind of coming in the second tier of the resource wars. So yes, it is appropriate to pay attention to the crass elements of Chinese commercial foreign policy and to exert continuing pressure on them to have other elements as well. But I don't think we need to be afraid of it, aware of it, but not afraid. And the fighter jet sales, it's going to be a long time before their fighter planes are comparable to the Western model. So this is, I don't think that's, again, an area of fear. Yes, back here.
Thank you. I love your writing in The Atlantic.
Thank you.
Based on current economic challenges around the world, all over the place, how do you sort of foresee business opportunity in China? And even more specifically, are there ways for companies all over the world to work with the Chinese government in a better, different way? Future tense.
So as a way of showing my enthusiasm for this question, keeping myself awake and indicating a different stage of the conversation, I'll take off my jacket and roll off my sleeves. So how many people here have done business in China? I bet some of you have. So you know that it is simultaneously a very challenging and very open and dynamic area. I'll talk about the field I've been writing about. So right now in the U.S., there are probably 1 or 2 airports of any sort being newly built. And in Europe, there are 1 or 2. In China, there's more than 100. more than 100 new airports. So if you're an architect, if you're a navigation equipment person, if you're Caterpillar, if you're Honeywell, this is where so much of the action is. In any infrastructure-related field, in lots of consumer goods for sort of aspirational rising class, there is so much more mojo and momentum in China right now for people willing to immerse themselves. And so something that made me feel good both about China and the U.S. is when I go to any remote, godforsaken place, I usually find some young American there learning the language, being an English teacher, setting up some dealership in the longer run. So I think that with full awareness that it is a challenging environment, it's usually somewhat more promising than challenging. My wife and I used to say that our guide for staying there is that it was always more interesting than horrible. And sort of high levels of horrible, but higher levels of interesting. The horribleness being pollution, other sorts of problems, but the opportunities are great. So I think if one is ready for the fray, that there are still lots of opportunities. And so if anybody's looking for sort of a predictable niche, will have problems. But if you're ready just to jump in, it is a great and exciting place. Yes.
Thank you. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't get your thoughts on current events, going back to the Beaujolais matter and up through Chen Guangcheng. But with the Beaujolais affair, for you, is it more of a? Do you see it as something that signifies that the reformers have won, or more fear out of exposure of what you termed efficient corruption?
My first point would be any outsider who is confident about what this means, I think, is making it up. I don't think anybody knows. I certainly don't know fully enough where this is going to lead or how it really got started. Second, some people have argued that we should be relieved that Beaujolais' ascent was arrested, to the extent that he showed that his rise would have meant more power for sort of old-style leftists or the military faction, and then perhaps we should be relieved that he's not going farther than he did. And if this means that there is actually a liberal reform faction, that it will have more traction later on, then that will be good. The main interpretation that rings true to me is simple factional politics. I think it is that more. You can strap ideological meanings onto them, but I think it's probably more factional than it is anything else. And so the only proper response from the West is to stand back and wait to see how this all settles out, and then see how we can deal with the surviving leaders and hope to push them along a path towards continued dealings. Does anybody here have a more informed view than what I saw? Is there somebody here who's confident in knowing whether this means the reformers or old-liners prevail? It's just as my default explanation for any development, for any new project in China is some real estate deal. That's the main thing which keeps things going. My default explanation for political news is factional struggle. And if there is some ideological meaning, fine, but I think it's more, that's my starting point and probably my ending point too. But if somebody has a alternate view, I'd be happy to hear it. I think that this was from the path of the dissident is a hard one. There were no good options for Mr. Chun and his family, in that if he stayed in his house arrest, he was in a terrible situation, so was his family. When he got to the U.S. Embassy, he had no good options either, because if he left China, his influence there will certainly wane, as it will. If he stayed in China, he'd be in a bad situation. Leaving China, probably some of his relatives are now vulnerable, and so he is a noble figure in what he has stood for, that of holding the communist government to its own standards, and even in his own case, because the national government, he was not guilty of any crime, just the locals who were beating up on him, with the central government not interfering to protect him. So I think from the Chinese government's point of view, this was a disruption they have now contained. They've contained it by getting him off the scene. I think it is fortunate that neither the Chinese nor the U.S. government decided to make this a first principles stand when it was in the U.S. Embassy, because that would not have done any good for him, and I think would only have made collateral damage for others in his circumstance. So he had a bad set of choices, and this is probably the least bad outcome for him, but it's not good. So that's the sort of bleak summary I have. But I'm glad the U.S. has received him, and I hope it protects him in all ways possible now. Yep. So, yes, here.
So just like many other industries, the aerospace industry is dominated by large state-owned airlines. So my question is, what would private companies, what are their role in the improvement of the technology of aerospace industry?
Now, that's a very good question. It's one more of these dramas that affect China in general, and also the aerospace industry, because as I'm sure you all know, state-owned enterprises in China, after decreasing in their relative importance, have been increasing in recent years. And that's where most of the big firms in China, of course, are state-owned enterprises. Most of the airlines are also state-owned. Hainan Airlines would be the main exception. It's a kind of Southwest/Virgin Atlantic jazzy airline. I think that the intention of the aerospace planners is to open more and more space for private airlines as the operations within China grow. But this is one more case of that same struggle you're seeing in the rest of the economy. The state-owned enterprises don't want to give up their room or their power or their protection. So this is so I don't know exactly how to predict it. I think the 12th five-year plan, it hopes for more private roles in these airlines, but we'll have to see how it develops. So this is a bad answer to your question because I don't have a good answer. It's one more case of the struggle between the state-owned enterprises and the private ones, and I hope the private ones expand because they bring a new level of efficiency, I think. But I can talk to you more about it later. So with that, thank you all. I really appreciate your attention and your excellent questions.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.